I am Don Thilmany, current AEA president, but today also playing the role of moderator because I was so excited, number one, that CRENET decided to put this panel together, and that second, when we had to pivot to a virtual schedule that so many sections, including CRENET, were willing to find creative ways to actually make that program available across the whole second half of 2020 so we all could join in at our leisure. And so today, the focus of the 4 panelists that you'll be hearing from, and this truly will be a panel, and we'll be leaving half the time for Q&A and hearing from you all as well, is how regional and rural development economists can be more effective in influencing public policy. You know, so often in AEA, when we've talked about our government relations challenges and opportunities, we overly focus on, you know, particularly economic research service and some of the federal things that we're all called and asked to give opinions on. But as you'll hear from speakers today, probably even more importantly in our municipal, local, state governments, we've also got a lot of our members out there who are kind of on speed dial and really getting to play pretty pivotal roles in informing both agencies and policymakers. So today, I hope the panel really helps you to start thinking about whether that's what you think you do or not. They give you some ideas about probably a broader set of us all could be doing this in a little more engaged way. So with that, I'm going to turn the program over to the people you're here to hear from, which is our speakers. And today we'll be going in the order that was listed on the AEA site, which is starting with Dr. Sarah Lowe, then Dr. Steve Deller, then we'll move to Sarah Lowe, then we'll hear from Heather Stevens, and then Dr. Steve Turner will be ending our program today. Again, they're all going to be talking 5 to 10 minutes. You're happy to throw questions in real time into the chat box, but we'll also be doing live Q&A that you can use your microphones and just ask the questions, and I'll be moderating those. And with that, let's go ahead and start with Dr. Steve Deller, who's going to give us some context of kind of where we came from in this space over the years at least I've been involved with CRENET, and I'll turn it over to Steve, who is a professor, it feels like everybody knows, but he's also with the Center for Community and Economic Development and the EDA Center they do have there at UW-Madison. And then most recently, he took my invitation up to be on our Government Relations Committee for AEA too. So this is a very timely role for him to be talking about. So Steve, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you all for joining us. Just a little background on what the CRENET group is. This is kind of a historical group that's been around for a number of years. Actually, 2 of our founding members, Dave Cheekwin and Bruce Weber, are on the webinar. But we kind of have historically, it's been a very informal group. We used to kind of meet at the conference hotel bar, and essentially it was a chance for folks that worked on rural development, community economics, to kind of get a chance to kind of huddle and network a little bit. The success of CRENET actually, I believe, established kind of the model for a lot of the sections that are now an integral part of the AAEA. I think what makes this group particularly relevant to our discussion today is that this is a real mix of extension specialists and researchers, and there's a real blending there. If you were to ask me any given member whether they're an extension specialist or kind of a traditional researcher, I don't think I could tell you because of the blending of how we go about our work. As you can see, that we've been fairly active in the AAEA. We've hosted a number of different types of workshops and seminars within and sessions within the professional meetings, and a lot of these have really kind of aimed at helping agricultural economists engaging in the community. That one that's highlighted there, I think, kind of really speaks to how we have this kind of, it's almost in our bones to do this kind of engaged work. If you look at the representation of the CRENET in terms of the work that's being rewarded by the AAEA, you'll see that we actually have a number of groups, a number of initiatives that have been recognized for their outstanding work. And it tends to be coming from the extension side because I think that's the nature of a lot of the work that we do. We're engaged in the nature of our work, whether we have a formal extension appointment or not. Now, what is an engaged university? I kind of feel so I'm preaching to the choir here a little little bit, but it's really it's a two-way street. A lot of the work that we do in terms of research and outreach education and service is really molded by the issues that are affecting the respective states that we work in. That influences what we work on. But the idea then is that what we find through our applied research is helping to inform the decision-making of local policymakers, whether that's at the state, federal, or local level, make more informed decisions. And essentially it's that two-way street that I think makes us as regional scientists, regional economists, if you will, within Ag Econ, unique and different. Now, when you think about the role of the universities in economic development, there's a couple of different ways to think about this. One is kind of economic initiatives. This is the kind of the gown and town type relationship. This would be the university perhaps making investments in real estate, things like that. Traditional knowledge transfer. This is kind of the old-fashioned extension model is we have technical expertise and we go out and we share that technical expertise. Of course, there's resident instruction, there's basic research, but also public policy. And I think that's where we kind of shine, is doing the policy analysis and doing the economic development research. That's kind of our niche, and that's how we kind of shine. Okay, now what are some of the ways that we can do that? Historically, information has flown from the university to the communities. We are the experts, we are the specialists, we have the knowledge, we have the information. And it flows that way. I think that that is kind of the historical, and I think it's changed. It's the expert model or the tech transfer model. It's kind of historically dominated that way of thinking. We've changed that. We've kind of turned it around. I know that when I work with communities, I'm often asking them, what are the issues that you're struggling with? How can I help you be more effective in doing the type of decision making that you're moving forward on? And I think it's that engagement, that going back and forth, I think is what draws a lot of us to regional science and the type of work that we do. So the question then is, what is our role in public policy discussion? Is it the expert model where we tell policymakers what to do? Or are we educators where we lay out policy options that are both the pros and cons are clearly identified? I tend to fall into the second one, where my opinion as a citizen really doesn't matter in my role as a regional scientist. It's really kind of, what is the research saying? The problem with this is that sometimes Tommy Thompson, our former governor, who's now the president of our university system, actually said, you know, we need fewer one-armed economists. Or we need more one-armed economists, because we're always saying on the one hand, on the other hand, just tell us what to do. So sometimes our roles change. What we're trying to do is we're trying to help communities make more informed decisions. Okay, we're not telling them what to do, we're helping them make the decisions. Okay, now we got to be sensitive to the policymakers and the concerned citizens that we're working towards. They're not policy wonks. Okay, what they're interested in is executive summaries. We're doing a series of reports right now on rural broadband, and we're working on a 50-page report. How many policymakers are going to read a 50-page report? Very, very few. So we have to try to congeal what our research is saying down to easy, almost tweetable type comments. They're busy and they're working on multiple issues at the same time. One of the things that used to really frustrate me as an extension specialist is that you would get an email blast from a county educator saying, has anybody done any work on name the topic? And I'd be like, I just sent something out 3 months ago. Well, when it landed on their desk, they weren't working on it and it got lost. Be aware of that. They have pre-held beliefs, okay, and they have to answer their constituents. They have to answer to party leadership. This is becoming more and more of an issue in terms of that second to the last bullet point. Just give me the answer. We need more one-handed economists. Okay. Now, how can we be more effective in terms of doing this? One is know the audience. When we're kind of helping inform public policy discussion, we have to realize who we're talking to. I kind of think, you know, something that Ron Schaefer taught me early on in my extension career is that you're kind of teaching Econ 101 over and over and over again around a relative topic. You have to develop credibility. You can't just kind of fly in, shut off and then fly out. You've got to develop credibility. You got to be thinking longer term, kind of in terms of I'm developing this relationship over very long term. There has to be a continuous stream of policy work, kind of one-off. If policymakers and concerned citizens and the media doesn't hear from you for 2 years and then all of a sudden something comes out, they're really not going to pay much attention to it. There has to be kind of a continuous stream. Offer options, not the answer. Build partnerships and relationships. That's working with legislative staff, state and regional local agencies, nonpartisan research agencies like the Wisconsin Legislative Fiscal Bureau, and the news media. Constantly be sending things to the news media and say, hey, are you aware of this new study? Are you aware of this? And just kind of keeping them informed so that you become a resource to these different folks, okay? Timeliness of work is the topic on the radar screen. Okay, again, if one of the reasons that the broadband work is so kind of relevant right now is because it's kind of in everybody's face with COVID-19. We've been working on broadband, we've been dabbling in broadband, but now we're kind of focusing our energy on it because the timeliness of the issue. Turnaround time. I've seen some of my colleagues that are not extension going, that's an interesting question. Let me get a graduate student working on it and I'll get back to you in a year. That doesn't work. Educated guesses are sometimes the best that we can do. Sometimes we get asked questions and it's like, wow. The best we can do is have an educated conversation. Be responsive. Don't say, okay, well, a newspaper reporter called me. I'll call them back in 5 days. It doesn't work that way. You've got to be responsive. And multiple methods of communication. Okay, so is regional science the embodiment of the age university? I think it is, okay? The tradition of extension within agriculture and applied economics, I think, is the secret sauce that allows regional science within the context of AAEA to thrive. Now, what are our challenges? Who are our political advocates in budgetary decisions? We don't have a farm commodity group that's going to call up the dean and read the Dean the Riot Act. We don't have that kind of political base. We're not very good at it. Are we the odd stepchild within agriculture and applied economics? I was just reading a paper about how is regional science the odd stepchild within economics? Are we the same odd stepchild within agriculture and applied economics? I think we might be, but I think the fact that so much of our work is recognized through awards and involvement in the association, I think that's changing with time. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. Perfect way to start our panel, Steve. And sure, there's a couple things you said that will be asked about later as well from our group. So I'm going to do the slides for our next speaker, Sarah Lowe. And I think a lot of you know Sarah. She may even be how you heard about this, as she's been one of our leaders communicating this. She is currently an associate professor of regional economics and the Henkel Chair in Agriculture at University of Missouri, and providing leadership to their Exceed program. And then we'll be talking not just about that perspective, but also some of the work she brings to also have worked at the Kansas City Fed and at the USDA Economic Research Service. So with that, I'll turn it over to Sarah on her perspective about shaping public policy. Sarah, just tell me how you want me to proceed with slides.
Great, thanks, Dawn. Yeah, as Dawn mentioned, today I'm going to talk a little bit about shaping public policy, both from the federal government perspective and an academic perspective. I spent 10 years at USDA Economic Research Service doing research on rural economic development. And I'm relatively new to academia. I've been here at University of Missouri for 2 years. I have a 50% extension appointment. Steve just talked about the blurred lines between extension and research, and that's certainly the case with my academic appointment. What I want to talk to you about today is kind of reflecting on my experience from ERS and at Mizzou. I want to say that policymakers are not necessarily in touch with rural development needs, and it's our job to articulate those needs to them. Steve just talked about this two-way street, and I think those comments you're going to see those same kind of comments in my remarks here today before the panel. So that two-way street, translating what we hear as problems creating frameworks for those problems, delivering that message to policymakers. All right, so we get started. Federal research and policy on rural economic development, the dream. Okay, so 2008, I land in Washington, D.C. I think I'm gonna change rural policy. I joined ERS. My first ERS publication was published in February 2009, and it was really timely. Rural Broadband at a Glance. It was published within days of President Obama signing the stimulus bill, which allocated at the time an unprecedented $2.5 billion for broadband in rural areas to USDA. So I felt like my first ERS research was timely, it was useful, and there I was in Washington, D.C., living the dream. The reality is I was hired at ERS for my research skills, not policy skills. So the reality is I'm sitting in a windowless cubicle, developing surveys, analyzing data, participating in confidential staff analysis. In truth, only a select few at ERS regularly interact with policymakers. I learned this, I became one of those select few towards the end of my ERS career. But as I was sitting in that windowless cubicle, churning through, chugging out research, I was surprised by how scripted things were at ERS. It was very top down. Everything we communicated was very carefully reviewed and scripted. I had one ERS report that had 17 peer reviewers. So for those of you looking at P&T and wanting to discount ERS reports, they have gone through far more scrutiny than any journal article, I will add. Next slide. So my colleagues and I at ERS, we studiously researched policy topics. We cheerfully distilled our academic work, our journal articles into briefings, short bulletins. Here we have an Amber Waves article. We tried to really make that research that we had done accessible to policymakers, as Steve just talked about. But we didn't really know how much our work was helping. We didn't get a lot of feedback. We produced things and we hoped that people read them, but we really didn't know. In fairness, I think policy work really distracts from research. To establish a solid reputation as a researcher, one needs to focus on research. So I see a lot of young scholars in the audience today. I encourage you to really focus on that research, put aside the dream of working at the White House, focus on establishing yourself as a solid researcher first. Again, Steve mentioned, this reputation and how important that is. As the years went by at ERS, I began to feel like the work that needed to be done wasn't getting done at ERS. Or maybe it was, but not fast enough. Again, Steve talked about timeliness. I felt like ERS just wasn't as responsive as I wanted them to be. I felt like my work was too carefully scripted. Travel was increasingly curtailed, and I became increasingly divorced from rural America. I had been inside the Beltway too long. I began to feel that my effectiveness at helping policymakers had diminished. I was a less effective advocate for rural economic development. And I felt like sometimes you've just got to get work done when it needs to be done. Next slide. Okay, so that was kind of how I ended up at University of Missouri. Of course, the biggest difference here is I have this nice office that you see in the picture. No, that's not the biggest difference. It is nice to have a window. The biggest difference, I think, in terms of my continued work in rural economic development is that the university is less top-down than ERS was. So instead of briefing one undersecretary and one agency administrator on manufacturing resilience, here you see a picture of me speaking to 400 manufacturing plant owners and technical assistance providers. So less direct on policy, but I'm talking to more people. I'm touching more people. Instead of answering my phone when congressional staffers called and saying, hey, I'm not allowed to talk to you until you go through USDA government relations, now I'm answering the phone right here fairly often, and it's state lawmakers, it's state elected officials calling me and asking, what can we do in our state for rural development? So I I'm enjoying the higher touch environment here at the university. And, you know, I've mentioned already at Mizzou, I'm doing research and extension and outreach and teaching. I'm wearing a lot of hats. So again, I just wanted to reiterate that for those of you junior scholars out there, try to really wear your research hat and establish your research credentials before getting too involved in outreach and extension. Next slide. So wrapping up, back to today's topic, improving our effectiveness at informing public policy. Again, I want to come back to this point that we probably need to help policymakers understand what rural development needs are. So I would love to see more cooperation between those of us that are at, say, land grant universities or economic development practitioners. I would love to see that kind of cooperation with the federal researchers, with the ERS researchers, so that we can use, those of us who are on the ground talking to a lot of different people can bring information and share it with our colleagues, our research colleagues, so that we can develop research that solves practical problems, that delivers practical solutions, and suggest things to policymakers so that they can go forward with a policy agenda. I think we're in a really unique role in that regard. Steve also mentioned just how important regional is within AAEA, within extension, and you know, just to kind of think about some of these relationships, these contacts in the field or contacts inside the Beltway, it goes both ways, right? Those contacts share an early look into what kind of problems need to be solved. Think also back to the model of ERS before 1984. Before 1984, ERS had researchers stationed at land-grant universities. So that model had pros and cons. But the idea was that those researchers at land-grant universities that were part of the federal system could feed information about what's going on in the ground to Washington, to inside the Beltway. So with this, my last slide, I just really want to encourage everyone to get out and get connected with the private sector, get connected with nonprofits, get to know your state and local governments. For those of us in land-grant universities, and for those at ERS, work with your colleagues at land-grant universities to get a better understanding of what's going out in the field. Don't get discouraged like I did and feel divorced from what's really happening in rural economic development. We as rural development researchers have a more holistic set of insights than politicians. So I think we're in a great position to put forth applied work that can help solve really practical problems. So thank you. That's it. Next.
Thank you, Sarah. And as you guys are finding out, we have lots of great perspective here today. Again, we're going to continue on for our last two speakers, but be thinking of questions because they're raising lots of things I think that can be pretty good discussion points. So for our next speaker, we're going to have Dr. Heather Stevens, who will put her slides up. She is at West Virginia University and was kind enough to be the co-organizer for this session along with Dr. Steve Deller. So she did a lot of the elbow grease to get us organized enough to have this panel today. And she's gonna focus her comments a little bit about, again, following along the theme that Sarah did about why we're not getting all of our policy research into the hands of policymakers and where there may be the incentives or not in the university system to make that happen more effectively. So with that, I'll turn it over to Heather. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Dawn, and thank you for being willing to moderate this session. Today I'm going to talk a little bit more about sort of the university evaluation process, as Dawn mentioned, and how this may play a role in sort of keeping our applied research from reaching policymakers. But before I go into my more detailed discussion, I do want to say just a quick thing about my background. So I am an associate professor here at WVU, and my focus is regional economics. But I had a prior career that some people don't know about. I started my post-undergraduate life working on Capitol Hill for 2 different members of the US House of Representatives. And then I got an MBA, worked at a big Fortune 100 business, and then transitioned into regional economic development. And I served some time as a local economic development director and working at a regional economic development center. And so when I came into this, I was thinking about how I could use research to kind of affect policy and have an impact at the regional level. And so I think there is something about the university evaluation process that maybe in some ways keeps that from being as effective as it should be. So, one thing is, this goes back to this research, teaching, research extension, teaching extension, the types of appointments that we have dictate how people are evaluated at the university. We all know this. But I have a research teaching appointment. And so this outreach component, while I can do it, especially when you're at a junior faculty level, right, it's not quite as valued in terms of going up for tenure and promotion. And so that can mean that less of it is done while we focus on the things that are valued, right? And so we all know what they are: getting grant funds, numbers and quality of our peer-reviewed publications. And these are the things that get you tenure, promotions, and raises, especially if you do not have a specific extension or outreach component to your portfolio. And those are what we have to focus on. For most of us are a big, research institutions, land-grant institutions, and those are the things that we have to focus on as we're going through this process. And in full disclosure, I went up for tenure and promotion last year, and if I had focused on outreach, I'm not sure I would have been successful as I was. Now, why does that matter? Well, and I'm not going to talk as long as everyone else. Well, to me, it matters because for those doing policy-oriented research, it means that we don't really see this impact, right? The stuff that Steve and Sarah talked about in terms of, we need to be making sure we're making these relationships and that we're getting our research out to policymakers, and we're doing research on things that matter on the ground. Well, if your focus is on producing publications, then you may tackle problems that have a unique econometric method or can be published in a top journal, but maybe not always that are the most relevant policy questions. And then the second part of that is that your research may not be reaching the audience that you want it to reach, right? And so if that's happening, as a researcher, especially given what I told you about my background, to me, I start to question, like, what is the point of doing this research if it's not going to make a difference? Because at some point, right, I'd like to see my research get out there. And then the second part of that is this whole land-grant mission, right? The land-grant university's mission in terms of making our research relevant to our states and to the nation sort of is at odds in some ways with this evaluation process at the university, unless you're doing extension work. And so I think that this is an important thing that we need to be thinking about sort of in the profession is, are we always in line with making a difference in terms of how we're evaluated? And so to me, there's several solutions. One is at the individual level, where we can choose to get tenure or get promoted and then make outreach more of a priority, right? We can say, okay, I've passed that hurdle and now I'm going to focus more of my effort on research that I know is needed in the state, research that I know is needed in the nation, in engaging the media, policymakers, and others so that we can get our research out there. And frankly, I mean, I've been doing this even before I went up for tenure, but I'm just saying that it's not necessarily something that gets you tenure. But I also think that at the department and institutional level, embedding more of this into the evaluation process is good both for individuals in terms of being able to, make that connection back to regional development. This is what Sarah was saying. She saw herself outside outside of rural development anymore and not really connected with what the needs were and the people there. So I think as researchers, it is sort of valuable, right, to see your work making a difference. But I think there's a second reason that institutions should care about this, is that it also is an opportunity, right, for institutions to show their value, especially public institutions, right? If the research that we're doing, and as regional economists or rural development economists, you know, we're doing research that actually has value to at least maybe the nation, if not to our regions that we work in. And I think if we can get that research out to policymakers and the media and sort of show that what we're doing at institutions in terms of our research actually has real world value, that can help universities show their value to their stakeholders, to, you know, policymakers in their state and others who you know, they make decisions about their funding. And then I put this up sort of other on here, but I think this is where AAEA can come in, because I think we might be able to come together and put together some best practices for maybe how this could be embedded into the evaluation process, and how this might be a way to sort of move forward and sort of, like I said, from an individual level, but also from an institution level, to sort of create this new value. And so that's all that I have today. I really just wanted to kind of put out some thoughts that hopefully spur some discussion. And I do want to kind of end with, you know, despite all this, I'm not pessimistic, because, you know, last year I went to this fabulous Federal Reserve Bank conference, which was researchers and practitioners working together. That was obviously before COVID. And then just, and over the last year, I've been working a lot more, because I want to, with our research communications team at WVU, to try to get both my research out, but also to be sort of a resource to media around our region in terms of economic questions that affect the regional economy. And it's been extremely valuable from that. So I think that there's a lot that could be done here, and I'm excited about this discussion. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Dawn.
Heather, that was perfect, continuing on the themes that have already been developed. And I know everybody's probably chomping, because some of this really feels like it's great fodder for discussion. But we have one last speaker, I think, who can add even a little more fuel to the fire, and that's Dr. Steve Turner. I've known him since early in my career, and he was one of those welcoming faces that definitely made me feel like I belonged to the AA. And so I was excited to see him on our panel today as well. He's currently also, Steve, if you want to go ahead and share your slides. He's also leading the Southern Rural Development Center there at Mississippi State. So he definitely has perspective on how we're doing in terms of interface, probably not just with policymakers, but how we do that even across our own colleagues. So he's going to give us a little insight on how he sees applied economist interfacing with rural and community development policy. And I love his keywords: navigation, persistence, and relationships. I think all of us would agree those are key characteristics of the people who've done this well. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Steve.
Thank you, Dawn. Thank you, all of you, 45 of you, or whoever is on. I'm going to try and be brief here. I know a lot of you have questions. Some of this is repetitive to the other three speakers, so I'll just go ahead and jump in. Let's see if I can move down here. Oh, yeah. So just to give you an overview, there's a couple of things I want to start off with, talk a little bit about applied economics and remind you what we're all about. And you can read that, foundation versus superficial, dimensions that we need to be aware of, research perspectives, and lessons for the future. So that's kind of where I am. You know, what strikes me a lot of times is the amount of economic literacy of our clientele. Now, sometimes we have very sophisticated clientele that are very economically literate, and sometimes we don't. But even with our economically literate clientele, I'm often struck by they forget some real basic principles and equations. I think, you know, if I could stress one equation, it's that second one there, profit equals revenue minus cost. I think, you know, we just need to keep pounding this home. I mean, I put microeconomics, but even at the macro level, profit, you know, if, you know, we don't ever talk about a balanced budget anymore. We don't ever, you know, most of us cannot print our own money, and local communities can't print their own money, and neither can states. And so that's a really big constraint. I know linear programming is not basic microeconomics, but these things about externalities, public goods, just some real basic things that we learn, portfolios. You know, not everything has to be a home run, a cash cow. So again, there's some basic economic things we need to always remember. Then down, I have below there, rural community development things that we need to remember. So again, you know, we're mostly dealing in geographic areas. We're mostly dealing always with people. There have been people in this that are on today have done a lot of work in the different capitals that we need to be aware of. And then I often remember that communities and organizations without a vision, a purpose, a plan, and strategy are not going to succeed. I mean, that's just really basic stuff. But again, you got to have a vision. So how can we contribute? Well, one of the things is, you know, sometimes people don't like us as economists because we're kind of the reality check. We're like, okay, where are your revenues going to come from? Oh, well, I got the best, we have the most beautiful blah, blah, blah. Okay, how are you going to turn that into revenues? Okay, costs are always there. Every one of us is a cost. I tell my students, if you can generate revenue, you'll never want for a job or a career. If you can generate revenue. Data analysis, that's what we're good at, especially those of us who come out of the agricultural economics background. You know, we complain a lot about our quantitative courses and all the others, but that's really one of our strengths. The other thing is we are schooled in financial disciplines. We're schooled in operations, and we call it production, and we're schooled in marketing. So those are three legs that any community development has to deal with. Now put space, time, and form up there. You know, I come out of a marketing background, and that was the thing that was always drilled into me was space, time, and form. And I won't go into the details of that, but that's always important. This is kind of a superficial slide, so to speak, but I like it, so I was going to put it up there. And that little picture there reminds me of COVID-19. My communications director got that. I don't know where she got it, but local investment is going to be important. Outside investment is important. Investment is important. Communities and us need to expect and plan for change. This 2020 has been one of the biggest change years that in most of our lives. Life cycle of communities. You know, we don't talk about communities. I have an aunt who, when we travel a lot of times, she'll say, this once was a thriving community. I love that line. This once was a thriving community. Well, it's not anymore. And most of the people have moved somewhere else to another thriving community. Also, energy and passion and vision. I can't repeat that enough. You got to have some vision out there. And even us as researchers and academics, we need vision too. Let's see here. So this goes kind of back to social capitals, and I call it dimensions. But one thing I've learned as director of a rural development center is that economics is important, but it's not everything. And sometimes it's not even the most dominant issue. So the other thing that I've learned is politics will always trump, so to speak, economics. Political interactions and political maneuvering, economics sometimes is a secondary and tertiary consideration. So we've got to be aware of that. And I also, you know, the financial, marketing, physical, social capital, social dimensions are very important to communities. You know, the question I often have is, does a healthy community have to be a wealthy community? I don't believe so. Does a healthy community have to be even a economically vibrant community? I'm not sure. But again, that's a question that we need to be asking. And then we talk about research. This is where most of us that are on this webinar, the reason we're here is because we're curious and we like to look into things and we like research. I mean, that's really it. And if you're in a university, I don't care what kind of university it is, you pretty much have shown that one of your skill sets is doing research, is completing research. Now, you've got internal, external, and Heather mentioned, you know, my internal is I got to satisfy my university and my professional peers and things like that. And then I have external clientele, so to speak, which Steve mentioned, quantitative and qualitative. Most of us as applied economists are better at quantitative. And then one of the things is cooperation and regional works. We found that in community development, regional is really one of the key areas to focus on. And then I mentioned include probabilities if possible. I want to tell you a story. So there's this thing called heirs property. And here at the Southern Rural Development Center, we were not really involved with heirs property. Heirs property is when a person dies without a will, and those assets are divided equally among the heirs. It's a real issue in land issues here in the South, in tribal communities in Appalachia and the colonias in Texas. Our advisory committee said, you need to be looking at this. So we started looking at this in conjunction with the 13 states and the land grants in our 13 states. Now, there is this uniform, what's it called? Where is it here? Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act. It's been passed in like 15 or between 15 and 20 states now. Mississippi was considering this act to pass. I mean, it was considering, the legislature was considering this act. Because of the research we've been doing on heirs property, we were able to get some estimates of the amount of heirs property in the 13 southern states, each state by county. So one day I was called by the lobbyist for Farm Bureau here in Mississippi. He wanted one thing. He wanted to know how much heirs property was in Mississippi. Luckily, I had my spreadsheet there with how much, what's the estimate in each county in this state. And I was able to give him a number, 111,000 acres. It was an estimate. It wasn't, you know, I told him I think it's low, but that's kind of what I could give him. The act passed. And part of it was the support of the Farm Bureau. And again, knowing that and being able to do that is kind of an example of what the others have said today. Being able to respond with the best estimate you can give them. Let me see if I got any more slides. So what are the lessons? Relationships matter, persistence matters, and navigation skills matter. One of the things that we often are lacking in is political skills, political navigation skills. That is not what we're schooled in. It's not what we're usually good at. But every department, every organization needs at least some people that are good at that. Okay. And then learn to maneuver. You know, this year's been great about the skies falling, but not really. It'll be something else next year. And then for all of you that are young out there and assistant professors or graduate students or whatever, play to your strengths. Shore up your weaknesses, but you're not, Michael Jordan did not get paid to play baseball. He got paid to play basketball. So find out what your strengths are and play to those strengths. Thank you, Don. Back to you.
Great. Well, we had a great panel, and now, as I expected, the questions are flowing in. So I'm going to do my best to handle them kind of as they came to me, and so you can see some of them publicly in the chat box. And although they may be directed to some of you, I think feel free to unmic, and any of the four of you can chime in. So first, Jane sent one to me that I'm going to put out there for you. And this was targeted to Steve Deller, but I think a few of you might want to talk about it. Is you and actually Steve Turner both talked about that we just need to remind people of the basic principles of economics, and that, you know, profits and revenues matter. But we also, as regional economists, are often brought into those discussions about public goods. And so how do we balance where we may be tempted to work because it's those economic development communities and so forth who carry a lot of swagger, versus those that are NGOs, and again, a little less well organized, but who are part of our the sciences we all study as well. So I'll pitch that one out there to the panelists first.
I'll take a first shot at that. One is, a lot of times these groups that we work with are advocacy groups, and sometimes they want us to hand them a smoking gun. And a lot of times there is no smoking gun, and they don't like being told that. There have been a couple of times I've gone in and I've given presentations and basically said the research doesn't back up what you're saying. Dawn, you know, I'm not a big, there's a lot of folks in the local food movement that don't really care for me because I'm basically saying you can't justify half the stuff you're saying. I joke and say I'm testing the limits of tenure, but I think that's a legitimate job for us, is to say, you know, sometimes the research isn't backing up what you would like it to say. Let me help you better understand what the research is saying and engage in that kind of a conversation.
But I guess, and this combines to another, actually, all these questions actually relate. From Sandy, then we talked about how do we balance that short term versus long term, because even to some of the things Steve Turner said about the healthiness of a community isn't always directly translatable to the wealthiness of a community, and some of those public goods and other things that aren't economics matter. But what we're good at is talking about trade-offs in a metric people are used to, which is, you know, the dollar difference between the, you know, the public good solution versus the, you know, so I guess that actually gets to Sandy's questions too, is how do we balance those short-term things, which, like Steve Turner said, are quick hits where we can look like we were effective because we got something passed, versus how a role it plays out in terms of where there are long-term solutions our communities and states need to be looking at. And any of you can answer that. It's an easy one. Come on, guys. Who's not jumping?
I'll jump in and say, I think there's so many short-term things that it's really hard for communities to put a lot of energy or certainly dollars into some of those longer-term things. Sandy, I know you do a lot of work on kind of environment and climate change, and I think that's on the radar for a lot of the communities that I work with. But especially now with COVID, there's so many other things like broadband access, jobs, healthcare that just gets in the way of the longer term issues.
Sometimes short-term issues are long-term, are results of long-term issues. In other words, you know, we see disasters. We see, especially these days, forest fires. We see winds that we haven't seen before. We continue to see other kinds of natural disasters. Those are very short-term. Those occur in communities and people. We have to react to that. I think there's a balance between the two. There needs to be people, we need to have people working on all fronts, so to speak. And that's where the portfolio comes in. That's where Don might focus on a couple of areas, and so might Steve Deller, and then Heather might be focusing on some others. Brian Whitaker, you know, is focusing on each of you, you know, that are on this call. You have some areas that you're more expert in than I am. But if I know you're the expert, David K., then I might call you or email you and say, here's an issue. What's the latest you know about this? And I think one of the, when I think of the forest fires and global change, that's an area that's ripe for examination.
Great.
I think that there's one of the challenges is that not all communities are ready to kind of undertake economic development. There's a lot of communities out there that are very reactive. They're not forward thinking. So communities that are more reactive, it's almost like that short-term response to a specific question or specific request with the aim of trying to help them to think a little bit more long-term. I had a conversation with Gary Green, who some of you know. Is it ethical, if a community is kind of apathetic and they only react to a crisis, is it ethical to create a false crisis to get that community moving forward? We kind of decided no, that's not really the role of the university. But what do you do with a community that is basically apathetic? Mark Lapping, the rural planner, proposed this notion of triage. Is that, perhaps not all communities can be worked with. So kind of prioritize those communities that are more forward thinking and better positioned to actually implement change. And let the ones that are kind of reactionary, let them go. When Mark suggested that caused a real debate within the extension groups, whether or not that's legitimate or not. But it's a challenge. It's a real challenge. And trying to be all things to all people within this area is the kiss of death. You'll drive yourself nuts trying to do that.
Well, two things, and I think one of them blends into this. First, there was a comment about this balance and a little more detail about the trade-offs early in the career. We've actually had whole mentoring workshops on this at AEA as well. And, I think part of this is even engaging we have a section that is all the administrators who run agencies and departments, and talking about, if we even need to go so far back as to rethink offer letters and making it crystal clear with roles and responsibilities that engagement, broader than extension engagement, which is a lot of what you guys have been talking about today, is something people will be rewarded for, and what metrics you're going to use for that. But I think part of the trade-offs people are talking about here isn't just that threat of if you're going to get tenure. It's the long-term play about how you establish yourself and your roots strong enough, you become the person Steve Deller or Steve Turner or Sarah or Heather calls when they want a best practice on how to do work in one of these spaces. And so that's really your longer term play of building your personal capital so that you have mobility and power and influence, and those relationships Steve told you to build are buildable because people need what you have. And so some of this is just really getting the right personal mentors, I think. But I think it is something where we also as institutions, and I, for instance, was very happy when we went to Google Scholar, because before Google Scholar existed, it was all about listing journals with impact factors, some of which I published in specifically to get the impact factor, not because I thought I'd actually get the readership who needed to see a piece of work. And now with Google Scholars at least having a wider net of what gets counted, and our extension work gets counted better in Google Scholar than it did when we were using journals. So that is a right progression. But again, perhaps it even becomes some way where we all get even better as a network about when we're using each other's materials, because we know you're the experts on broadband. I don't even think we do a good job of telling our colleagues when we're using their stuff so that they can note somewhere that 12 different state programs are using parts of what, the toolkit was a great project I got to be on with Steve Della, for instance. That's the first place we've kind of been able to track for one piece of our work where it's all getting used, because we set up the website right under the guidance of Becca Jablonski. So I think some of this is us being creative about finding the right metrics for what engagement looks like and helping each other measure it better. And the last thing I want to get to, because there's quite an active chat about whatever happened to the public policy issue culture we had at AEA. Some of you young ones won't even remember. And I really do believe Choices was our attempt to bring something back that did that. But how sad that we have a more active printed publication version of education than we're doing it all live, virtual, engaged with audiences. And so maybe we'll end today, but we can linger a little bit better, longer than the hour, on each of the panelists' perspectives about what exactly bringing back public policies, education forums that would get to some of these trade-offs between short-term, long-term, how do we, how we share across our organizations, best practices about how to communicate on specific wicked problems. Well, let's hear all of your perspectives as we wrap up about that particular suggestion in the chat box, because I think it actually encompasses a lot of the points all of you made today. So let's go in the order that we talk. So we'll start with Deller.
I think that's a great idea. I think we should revisit that, particularly for assistant professors or people that do not have tenure, whether you're academic staff or you don't have that protection of tenure. A couple things. I think that, to Heather's point, I think one of the things that makes this job so much fun is that how can you develop an applied research program that also is feeding into the extension program? How do they feed off of each other? I think that's the fun part, is how can I work with Brian Whitaker on doing applied research related to broadband and get that out into a format that's more of an outreach publication? I think that's what's the fun part. But for an assistant professor, I think they got to be really kind of focused on what they're working on. They got to have a theme, and they're kind of focusing on that theme and then trying to get two sides off. Now, the public policy discussion is that second side, is how do you get this information out into the public domain in such a way that, and everything is so politically charged nowadays, that it's like no matter what you put out, someone's going to take offense to it. How do you do that in a way that you can bring the issue up, you can talk about the issue, but it's not perceived as a political hack job?
Great. And next, Sarah, do you have a perspective on this?
Yeah, I guess I qualify as the young ones who are not super familiar with PI, with public issues education. So I would love to learn more about it from some of you. Maybe that needs to be a future webinar. But what Steve Deller just said about the politically charged, that's what makes me very hesitant about doing some of this work, is the politics. I am in a very divided state. I'm an outsider. I'm an immigrant to this country. I am from Washington, D.C. Those two things do not make me popular in Missouri. So I shy away from a lot of the politics. I try to be very research focused, very objective, because it's very messy here in Missouri. And I know a lot of you are in similar states. So maybe others could comment on that too. But what Steve said, what you said, Steve, about the politically charged, that just makes my teeth itch.
Heather, maybe your teeth are itching less. So do you want to chime in on this?
Well, I guess like I said, I have sort of a different perspective just because I've been on the other side. But before tenure, I was way more cautious. I was asked to sign on to a letter that I knew was going to be politically volatile, yet was factual about regional economics in our region, and so I didn't. But now I sit on the advisory board for the same progressive group that's looking at alternative economic development strategies for the region. So I guess maybe I'm being less cautious, but I do think that this idea of having education about how to engage policy, I'm guessing that's what this public issues, is that what you called it?
Yeah, it was. Oh, do you want to explain it, Dave Lemie, or one of you who posed those questions?
Well, I'll just finish. I think that anything that provides people with that perspective, I mean, for people who don't come from that background, I mean, my undergraduate degree, before even working on Capitol Hill, I was a public policy major. So I kind of came into even that with a different perspective than a lot of people would in this profession. So I think that those kinds of backgrounds are really useful when you're engaging with policymakers.
I can say a couple words since I put this post out there. So I was a Purdue undergrad and got my master's there, worked there for a few years, and had the opportunity to work around some of the older faculty there that have now long since retired. My office backed up against Earl Butt's office, for whatever that's worth. But we had people like Otto Doring there, who were masters at laying out these economic arguments that were fact-based, very carefully put together so that people could see that they were explaining different potential alternatives that were available to whoever the decision makers were, the economic and other consequences, social, environmental, whatever, and they just laid it out into a decision-making framework from which they could kind of escape and let those whose decision it was to make actually make the decision, and their job was to basically inform that decision. And it was a rich tradition there. I know that there were people, I hear names of like Heavy Kohlmeyer, I think. There were some folks at Kansas State, I remember back in the day. There used to be a national group that would come together and they talked about this stuff for 2 or 3 days in a row, public issues education group. And so a lot of people were kind of steeped in that. They were well trained in it. Maybe more important than that, their institutions would back them, their departments, and all the way up through their deans of agriculture. Even presidents of universities, I'm sure, got involved in some of the things that, those gnarly public issues that are out there that need the insights that our profession can offer to help people make better decisions. So I see that it's being revived, perhaps, in a place out there in Montana, but that's one person. I'm not sure how big the effort is. I just think it's something that our profession is perhaps not completely lost, but it's not organized and as cohesive as it used to be, perhaps.
Well, and again, I know people are starting to drop off, but that's definitely something we could consider as a way forward, particularly if we engage the extension committee. And I know there's a little overlap between this group and that group about if there's a way to start thinking about how we do that as a group think again, because I think some of this politic people are worried about is, again, if it's sanctioned by a group, that a group put it together as Cornelia put it in the group, sometimes we're all worried about where we're going to get caught in crossfire. Well, perhaps that personal crossfire doesn't happen if what we're presenting is something that's been, third-party certified by an organization that's bigger than the individual who has to present it. And that's how you get and navigate around some of the politics. But that, again, would take a new concerted effort and thought process about how we actually all come together to try to put that kind of programming together and the structure that would require. But it sounds like there's enough interest there. It's at least worth considering if that's a way forward, and whether it's a Farm Foundation support for it or NEFA support for it. It sounds like it's at least a discussion we need to follow up and have. And maybe Steve Turner, you could even bring it up in the circles that are the rural development centers to see if there's some way with additional support from NEFA, you guys, because you guys certainly are doing that. If you think about the set programming you did and some other things that I've seen come out of the centers, perhaps that would be a place we could turn to as a place to institutionalize those. So again, I think this was a good discussion. We probably needed a little more time, but I am so excited to hear it happening. And perhaps we'll circle back with CRENET and Extension and see if there could be something yet again this winter where we talk about if there's a pathway forward to actually take some of just the things that were discussed today and turn them into actual real steps forward that would make it easier, particularly for young faculty who are just newly learning how to navigate this. Perhaps it's even with the mentoring committee about that being part of I think part of it is about guidance and good things to do at different stages of career. And I think other of it are things we could do as a group that would make it more cost effective for all of us to do what we have to do and the specialist we have to be in all things, it seems like. So let me ponder that. We'll capture again this chat box in the recording that's going to be sent out as well. And we appreciate everybody who came today. Again, we'll stick around here. I just realized I needed to at least do a little bit of a wrap up for if people did need to drop off. But if you want to stay a little bit longer, I don't think any of our panelists are rushing away. But thank you for a very engaged discussion. And again, Heather, maybe we would even shut off the recording so if people wanted to talk more candidly about things they have challenges and concerns about, that might be good. But thank you for coming. Everybody.
Yeah, I can shut it off in a second. I did want to respond to something, I think it was from David Kay. It was a follow-up to my presentation. I think that, to answer your question, David, I think that it's different for every position what you're expected of, right? What's expected of you, and I think it's just important, maybe going back to the suggestion of it being in offer letters or something like that, that we, if it's part of our mission at our university, and if it's something that we value in the profession, that we find a way to make it a more formal part of people's appointments, and not something that they kind of do on the side while still having to do all their other stuff, because it's not going to be as valued. I'm not saying it's not completely valued. It's not valued at all. It's just not the thing that's going to get you tenure, for example, in a research position. If you do that, I mean, it won't hurt you, but you have to still also do all the research. And so I just think there needs to be a way to maybe say, if you do one less publication toward tenure, for example, but you've made this big impact in terms of outreach, or you've, really kind of elevated the reputation of your university and your state, or whatever it is, that maybe that gets kind of counted a little bit differently, right? A little bit more of flexibility in that regard. That was my thinking, but I'm sure other people have other thoughts on that. Would people feel more comfortable if I stopped the recording? Because I'm welcome to, I would be happy to.
I just wasn't sure if anybody wouldn't feel comfortable having some of the things they have concerns about, but
okay, I'll just stop it then, and we can have an informal discussion, and what's been presented so far will be available for other people. Okay.
One of the things that